Good evening, all.
Good evening, Lisa.
Hi, Charlie. Charlie Theo.
Lisa,
Hi,
Connell.
folks.
Hi, Audrey. I don't see you, but hi, how are you? I hear you.
Happy belated birthday.
Well, thank you.
I meant to text you.
That's all right. I know where your heart is, so it's fine. I appreciate it.
It's in good birthdays.
Yeah. So always nice to have birthdays, right?
Absolutely. Trust me, I know.
Hey, Lisa, it's Linda.
Hey, Linda, how are you?
Good, good, good. I would show myself on video, but I look like I'm at home right now.
That's okay. I appreciate it.
Listen. When I heard you didn't sing, you sang in that video.
You watched the video?
I said, who is that? I was like, girl, you know what I'm saying.
I do. Thank you. Don't make me smile. I see Cheryl Johnson Watts up there smiling, so stop.
You better hold on to that. You better hold on to that. Blessings.
Thank you. I received that, Linda. And to God, I give all the glory.
Amen.
Not about me.
Amen.
Yep. Thank you. I'm humble.
Just don't be surprised if I call you to try to book you.
No problem. Never a problem. Just let me know.
We'll have to share that video out.
Okay, Charlie.
So who do we, good evening, Linda. Good evening, Cheryl. Nick, good evening.
Hey, Charlie.
Audrey.
I think we're waiting on Ms. Harris, and then we have the 8 that will be in attendance once she's on.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's funny when everybody's head doing this, looking through the gallery. I see Miss Phoebe Harris has connected. Hello, Phoebe.
Hey, y'all. How y'all doing?
Hi,
We're
everyone.
doing well. At least I hope we are.
What'd you say?
I said, at least we're doing well. At least I hope we are. So let me.
No.
All right, perfect. Let me call the meeting to order. This meeting, which is a special meeting of the Finance Committee of the Whole on Tuesday, February 23rd. We have 2 items on the agenda tonight. One is an update, project update from the IU, who's been working with us for quite some time. And the other is a projection, a report update from PFM. Both of these are kind of ongoing. And just to give a sense of history, you know, we've been working at this, the PFM one. The first one was in 2017, which gave us a good snapshot of where we were. And this updates that 4 years later with fresh and new projections. And the IU obviously helps us get more accurate projections for what they're doing. So that's on the agenda tonight. And I would like to thank Cheryl Johnson Watts for taking the meeting last week. I wasn't sure where I would be. I was actually traveling, and I appreciate that. Ms. Johnson Watts, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And Ms. Wilt, is there anything that you have at this point that you'd like to add as president?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so I'll open this to the public on agenda items at this time. If there's anybody from the public that'd like to speak on the, excuse me, the 2 agenda items, the IU report and the PFM projection report, if you raise your hand, we'll recognize you and you'll have an opportunity to speak for 3 minutes. And seeing none, then we'll move on to Mr. Parker. Mr. Parker.
Thank you. For no comments, I'm ready to dive in. So this evening we are updating, as Mr. Thiel said, our financial projection with the district. If you've been kind of with us for our community members over the last number of years, we've taken a really comprehensive and really strategic approach to addressing the financial issues facing our district, and not just the money, but the processes by which we define the resources that we have available in the district. So tonight we have two presentations for you. We'll begin with the presentation from CLIU 21 on process updates for our fiscal business and HR functionality. And then we'll end with an update from PFM. In 2017, they entered the district after some issues in terms of reporting of financial information were identified by the board. Based on the board's identification of issues, we paused filling some positions in that budget. That was my first year. We paused filling some positions in the budget that year and asked PFM to come in and do a more comprehensive fiscal analysis to give us a good sense of, from a 3-year look back and a 5-year look forward standpoint, what our fiscal capacity and trajectory would be. And using that information, we plotted out over the next 4 years rather, how we were going to sustain the fiscal needs of the district. Well, now we return 4 years later with the opportunity to revisit, how we've done in the past 4 years, and then project out what the district's needs are for the next 5 years. So a really comprehensive continuation of a strong conversation that this district and this board has been engaged in for a number of years. I'll say, if you look back at our strategic framework, none of this happens sans context. Our strategic framework, goal area number 4, really speaks to our responsibility for strong fiscal management and outlines for us what that includes. And this fiscal analysis is a part of what we identified as part of our strategic framework. So we're continuing, and to this board's credit, everything that we do is continuation on what it committed to with the strategic framework. So we're excited to bring this conversation today, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all in one bucket. So Ms. Ramos, I'm going to kick the ball to you for opening, and then I'll step back in as necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. You stole some of our thunder a little bit there, so I think maybe you're getting me back from this morning.
Absolutely.
Let me just reverse my screen here. Okay, so as Mr. Parker said, I'll just quickly go through a little bit of context and a walk down history lane, if you will. But the work that we're bringing forward tonight, if you recall, the board approved us moving forward with a revised PFM projection back in, I think it was November. And so we've been working very closely with them. Our entire core team and our finance team and the IU have really put down, and we spent a lot of time with them. And that was driven out of a lot of the work that occurred and a lot of the, I'll say, issues, if you will, that were occurring back in 2015, 2016, when the district discovered an unexpected surplus, and we kind of moved into sort of that board's commitment to get to the bottom of things. And with that, as Mr. Parker mentioned, the district did pause on filling positions. We didn't hire any new positions. PFM came in, they updated, gave us an initial fiscal analysis. And I think it's safe to say we've used that review to the greatest extent as we possibly could. I believe we got our money's worth there. And we kind of started to shift with our new superintendent and our strategic framework around some of the things that needed to happen. But before we could really make those shifts, there were some audits that were conducted. And I know that we're all very aware, but 2 of the audits, and especially in the finance HR system, that really forced our hand was that look at Skyward, and not only how the district was using it, but also how the district wasn't using it. And a lot of that work combined with the PFM review pushed us in a direction where we partnered with CLIU 21 So tonight we're going to spend some time getting a project update around their work. And as Mr. Parker already said and stole the thunder around, we're very focused on strategic goal area 4, because we're not only aligning our expenditures, our goals, but we're really sort of searching and developing those systems that will help us implement the policies and the expectations that the board's setting forth around how we spend our dollars, how we allocate resources. So if you recall, in 2017, 2018, as Mr. Parker mentioned, there was a multi-year look, and Mr. Parker has brought that projection forward numerous times because that allowed us to sort of stop, pause, pivot, and do some things differently. And it wasn't just about stopping the spend or looking at ways to save dollars. It was focused on how to manage the systems and develop the internal measures and controls that we needed to put in place in order to be transparent and to know what data we had available to us and to be able to make those decisions. And so that sort of pivot, if you will, pushed us in the direction of really identifying a lot of weaknesses in the system and owning them and moving forward. And the IU has been our partner in that work. Coupled with what happened in 2015-16, and this is out of the old, at this point outdated PFM projection, but somewhere around 15-16, you'll notice that the district had to start to dip into reserves in order to make things work. And so tonight you'll see the revision to this, but this was kind of a clinch year where we really had to come forward and start to do things differently. Mr. Parker, I'm going to pause here for you.
Yeah, could you go back a slide for me though?
I sure will.
Just to build context, if you're looking at the screen, you'll see in 14-15, there was an ending fund balance, that tall blue line of $36.4 million. In 15-16, that fund balance ended at $31 million. In 16-17, fund balance ended at $17 million. And then 17-18, essentially flat, right? $500,000, right? So you begin to see this downward trajectory of the district's fund balance, which indicated the structural deficit that the district was facing, was eating into fund balance. And at 17-18 had pretty much eliminated the fund balance and kind of caused the district to go into a negative spiral. So if you could flip to the next slide. So what I think is really important in looking back at the history here is when we asked PFM to come in and do this analysis, we asked them to give us, and I think I used the phrase back then, to undress us as a district, right? We want a bare analysis that allowed us to project what our baseline is so that we could make decisions on that baseline that would eliminate or eradicate some of the financial issues of the district, knowing that there's a structural deficit, but there's still decisions that can be made at the district level, whether that's identifying new revenue sources, if that's eliminating certain expenses. All of those are decisions that can be made at the district level, advocating at the state level for additional resources. And you all know that I've waved the flag 100 times about the great support that we've received from our local legislators, Senator Brown, Representatives Schlossberg and Schweier, in helping address the financial issues of the district over the past few years. All of those things happened in the interim from that first fiscal analysis. And the slide that you see here before you now is kind of speaking to the district's current status based on decisions that have been made utilizing the information from the original analysis. So if you see the blue line is kind of that projected deficit that was in the original analysis. And again, that was a raw analysis that was sans any decisions that the district had the ability to make. If I'm not mistaken, and I know Dean is on, there was a section in the original analysis that actually laid out a number of options the district could pursue to eliminate portions of the fiscal deficit. And the district did a really good job of addressing some of those, but also looking for additional revenue options in the interim. So if you see the blue line showing the deficit slope, pretty steep slope, where we're around projected at about 120 million in deficit for 2020-21. If you look at the green line shows our actual, so the actual slope of where our fund balance, our deficit has been over the last 4 years. So again, kudos to this board, kudos to the members of the Allentown community. There's been a lot of sacrifice. There's been a lot of advocacy for additional resources. We've been able to, based on the projection that was shown, significantly improve the short-term and long-term outlook of the district. So as we look forward to the great work that Dr. Ives' team at the CLIU has done to support the district, and the analysis of the next 5 years, which if you haven't read the headlines, will absolutely show a deficit that has to be addressed if the district doesn't do X, Y, and Z. I think the lead in is we've seen the deficit and we know the types of decisions that we have to make internally to flatten the curve, but we also know that we have to push and advocate at the highest level for additional resources to raise the ceiling in terms of being able to fund the district and address the needs of all of our children.
So where we initiated a lot of the work happened around the Skyward review. And just really high level, some of the things, some of the glaring things that came out of that Skyward review were the fact that obviously the system wasn't being used to its full capacity, but coupled with the lack of systems above and beyond using an online system, the lack of human resource and fiscal systems was further impacting our ability to use Skyward. You can't layer and use a system if you don't have those internal controls built. One of the other glaring things that came out of that Skyward report was the fact that position control was non-existent. And I say was because I'm excited to share with you the status of where we are today. And then there were some budget issues. There weren't revisions being used and our budget entry was very limited. There wasn't budget entered for grants. And so again, all work that the IU came in to support with. So tonight, what you'll hear high level, the IU is going to update on the work that they've done around helping us build systems as it relates to our frontline recruiting and hiring. That's a system that we need to use to manage the folks that we bring into the district, and ultimately that feeds our position control system within Skyward. You'll hear a little bit about how we are finally moving away from paper in regards to our hiring processes and implementing electronic forms to drive those systems. And we are have at our disposal much more comprehensive reports and data mining opportunities. From a finance standpoint, Ms. Hauser will address improvements that have been made to the budget development and how we enter data into Skyward, as well as some of the work that's been done around benefits allocation and our chart of accounts. And I'm certainly not going to steal their thunder, but when you look at what came out of the 2017-2018 Skyward report, which were pretty glaring issues, to where we've come over the last 3 years, I think you'll see some significant improvement. So, Mr. Parker, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Again, I think the story really is a continual process of improvement, and this is a really great opportunity to kind of do a dipstick on progress and look forward to additional challenges and opportunities.
And so with that, The IU is here this evening, as Mr. Thiel mentioned, and Mrs. Talapan and Mrs. Hauser are here to lead our presentations, and then obviously we'll move into PFM. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn the presentation over to Mrs. Talapan, and I believe Ms. Connors is here somewhere.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Ramos. We are pleased to be here this evening. So thank you for the opportunity to provide the board with an update on the business and human resources projects. Mrs. Hauser is here this evening. Mrs. Stair is here this evening, along with Ms. Connors. We will begin with an update on our human resources project, and we are pleased to report that this intricate project is on schedule. You may recall we visited you in November, and we reviewed the steps that we were undertaking to pivot when Allentown decided to go with frontline recruitment and selection. At that point, we were in the midst of building new systems, electronic workflows, forms, reports, and documentation, and we have successfully stayed on our target timeline. These systems that you're going to hear about this evening have been built by incorporating conversations, meetings, trainings with a cross-section of stakeholders, departments, and we hope that this will not only make the processes more efficient, but also enhance communication. So at a high level, just to remind the board what we have done to date, and then we're going to hear more about what's in the future. First, all of the labor groups and positions have been created in Skyward. Position control was our main focus starting this project, which did not exist. So at this point, we are able to have reports regarding how many positions are filled, vacant, or on hold. It sounds simple, but it's a pretty significant step. We have position management procedures in place that are documented and trained on as well. Frontline recruiting and hiring implementation for housing position management forms and workflows is completed. And in November, when we were here, we were just embarking on that. So we have stayed on target. And we are in the midst of the employee data scrub. If you recall, when we were completing the workflows, we knew that we had to go through every single record, and that is in process right now. And finally, we have assisted and delved into Skyward modules so that the district can utilize Skyward to the greatest degree possible and for efficient utilization within the human resources department. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Ms. Connors, who has done a great amount of the work to ensure that we stayed on target for our objectives.
Thank you so much for having us today. We are really excited to share our progress on this project. To make sure we don't miss anything in our progress, we have broken the project into 3 categories: Skyward, Frontline, and Employee Profile Data Scrub. Since we last spoke, there have been many successes, as Mrs. Talapan has pointed out, and a few additions to our project that help support the overall outcome. First, let's give you an update on where we are with Skyward. In addition to the milestone in the project of completing all labor groups and positions and assignments, we have explored and implemented processes for extra pay, extra duty, stipends, budget codes, positions on hold, income protection, and other leaves. We have begun to explore the salary negotiations module in Skyward, which has not yet been used by ASD. Based on our initial setups of this module, we may be able to help in terms of looking at position costs and help with budgeting. As we continue to develop this module, we will be able to help ASD determine if this is a useful function. Reporting has become more robust as well. Reports are delivered to stakeholders once a month for review or as needed. The newest report that we have found in Skyward is the placement report in the salary negotiation modules. This report is something ASD has not been able to obtain through Skyward previously. For Skyward, we have identified key factors that continue to be a driving force in this project, that we continue to look at as we move forward. Communication is key. We have monthly communication with stakeholders, HR staff, and other departments as needed. Skyward functions, ensuring the systematic functions of Skyward work properly with our position control setups. Training, this includes training documents, booklets we have put together for ASD, as well as training sessions for all. We continue to audit to make sure our data quality is there and accuracy exists. And finally, processes and procedures. We strive to continue to identify and develop key processes to help maintain the position control framework. Moving to frontline recruiting and hiring. This was a program we have identified to hold the tools to implement electronic forms to help maintain position management information. To give you an idea of what we've been doing, last we spoke, we were in the midst of procedures and electronic forms that created a workflow through different departments such as human resources, business office, and grants that organized and maintained information along with new hire information and any other staffing changes. The forms have been created, the HR staff has been trained, and the pilot program began in January, and we are seeing really great things. The principals using it have given great feedback, and HR has been a great partner with helping develop these forms as they are further used. This month, we began training the rest of the principals in the district to begin using these forms as of March 1st. And the administration buildings will be set to go live as of April 6th. Currently, everything is on track. Another great call out that occurred was the need for updating funding to positions between human resources, business office, and the grants office, identifying what they would need to place in a request. We have developed a form and am currently on the way to piloting with the grants office to eventually expand out to the special education department as well. Lastly, we have begun on the employee profile data scrub. We are currently working on active and inactive employees in Skyward and plan to follow up with clearances and addresses. As we continue to work through this, we may identify more areas that need attention. Verification will be very important, and we are working with human resources and the business office on that. In addition, we also realize the need to identify any additional processes that may be imperative as we organize this data to ensure data accuracy moving forward. So in summation, to bring it all together, position control implementation is on track. We are on track for the position control plan, the XYZ plan, to go live as of 7/1/21 and be the plan at ASD. And training has already begun on this. Frontline recruiting and hiring, we are underway to having the whole district using forms in this program by April. Additionally, we are helping get the whole HR staff into using all aspects of frontline and how they relate to forms and position control. We will continue to explore and develop salary negotiations module and see what it holds with information for Allentown. And as we noted, the employee data scrub has begun and will continue. Lastly, we will continue to provide HR system support to any and all departments that need it. Thank you so much.
So just in close, all of the successes, the accomplishments, the achievements that have really accelerated in the last few weeks, few months since we've been here in the midst of very demanding times. We really do need to acknowledge the commitment from Mr. Parker, Ms. Ramos, Dr. Brown, Mr. Pigeon, his team, Harry in the business office. You know, this has truly been a committed effort from the administrative team, all the directors and the principals who have truly embraced the training, the efficiencies that are being presented. And we look forward to having that commitment moving forward and reporting more successes and achievements as we are quickly closing out 2021. Thank you.
Are there any questions on the HR side? We still have the finance update from Ms. Hauser as well.
No questions, just a thank you. I just want to thank you for the work that you've done to help us move this project forward. It'll hopefully streamline the work that's being done by our admin and our building principals. So appreciate your effort.
And on that note, unless there are any other questions, I would like to introduce Mrs. Hauser and Jen. I don't know if you, but I do want to just acknowledge from an IU perspective, the teamwork that is occurring with Mrs. Hauser and Mrs. Stair and the staff that are working in the business office. We are seeing equally the same level of achievement on the business office project. And from an IU, on behalf of Dr. I, both we appreciate the commitment and value the steps that we're taking forward. So, Ms. Ramos, unless you have anything, introduction, Mrs. Hauser
No.
can take. Okay.
Yep, she can dig right in. I believe she can share screen.
Yep, getting there. All right. Again, as previously stated, I just want to also thank the ASD and its leadership for the opportunity to assist the district in developing some lasting change in the business office. Tonight's update is intended to give you a high-level look at the things the finance team has been working on over the past several months. Our agenda for tonight is to look at the project focus items and budget preparation for 2021, 2022. Get all the years out, too many 20s. Additionally, additional objectives for the remainder of this current school year, and an opportunity at the end then for the board to ask any clarifying questions if you have any. We've broken the current work down into 10 focus areas to include developing a budget process, digging into the functionalities of Skyward systems, updating student activity accounting to bring the district in compliance with new regulations, documenting and developing accounts receivable processes, working toward monthly benefit allocations, continued grant tracking and reporting, remaining compliant with the PDE chart of accounts, creating audit process documentation, creating special education funding and reporting documentation, and updating the food service accounting function. To track these numerous sub-projects, we've developed a timeline and project management tracking sheet that is updated weekly and communicated to the ASD management team. We have coded the projects and then break them down into further tasks, etc. We release updates to the project tracker weekly. We also provide the business office with a weekly memo of important due dates for upcoming external reporting and have created a high-level state reporting calendar. We meet weekly with the ASD management team to check in on status and to share updates. Key to any reporting is ensuring that the chart of accounts is current, up to date, and compliant with pronouncements from PDE. This has been and will continue to be an integral part of the project and the business functions. The state requires the standardized use of codes in order to produce comparisons of districts, application of ratios, and other critical pieces of like finance information across the 500+ districts and charter schools in the Commonwealth. On the revenue side, we have made great strides this year, bringing into compliance both function and funding source. On the expense side, work continues. We began with the functions. This is the part of the accounting string that tells you the where of what is being spent. Is it regular education, special education, finance department, maintenance department? In this area, the regular instruction or the 1100 series has been completed, and we've moved on to updating the 1200 through the 5800 series, which represents special ed and then moving through the support functions. We have simultaneously been reviewing the objects. This would be the what is it spent on section of the account string, such as payroll, tech, supplies, benefits, those kinds of things. We've completed and brought into compliance the payroll objects, which is the 100 series, and the benefit objects, which is the 200 series. These two series account for over 60% of the expenses in the district. Work continues on the 300s through the 900s. Lastly, as previously communicated, we have already standardized the instructional organization, which tells you the level of school, elementary, middle, or high school, or administration, and the operational unit, which building or department. These have been implemented across the district and are being used today. These items are critical when you're doing your ESSA or by school reporting. Budget preparation started in the late fall and is ongoing. The state's budget timeline was updated for ASD use and communicated to the appropriate stakeholders, including principals, department heads, and ASD leadership, as well as the finance subcommittee. Templates were distributed to all schools and departments and grant leaders and have been consolidated for use in analyzing a starting point for the 21-22 consolidated budget. In addition, the CLIU team, in conjunction with the business office, has met with those budget leaders to review their individual budgets for understanding and cost minimization. The general fund budget for 21-22 continues to be a work in progress. Outside of budget and account codes, we have created a manual for student activity accounts, and once approved by ASD leadership, training will begin with the appropriate staff. All business at the business office level, quarterly reconciliations will occur to ensure that club balances match the business office. Revenue accounting and proper billing of external parties is ramping up and will be a focus later in the spring. Additionally, we are working on developing either a monthly or quarterly process to allocate benefits to covered employees' departments, which is critical to both federal and state grant reporting of costs. Food service accounting and budget creation is being updated, and the accounting methodology of this vital function for the district is under review. We will also be assisting in the reorganization of the financial accounting around food service going forward. Lastly, we are working closely with grants to update and maintain a master grants file for all grants, local, state, and federal. We are reviewing the methodology of accounting for all the grants, creating grant reporting processes, reviewing the timeline of reporting, and supporting the creation of monthly operational expense reviews for grant leaders. With that, I just want to wrap up by saying that none of this work could be possible without the help of Mr. Aristakazian, Mrs. Kakazi, Mrs. Mulhelski, and Mr. McKenzie, and the rest of the business office team. This work is important and ongoing, and the district's focus on improvement shows in the accomplishments thus far. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ms. Ramos or the board for any questions.
Thank you. Just wanted to say thank you to the IU and working through a lot of these systems and processes. It's been a long time and a long process to get to where we are today. And it allows us as an organization to be responsible for what we do have and to, as Mr. Parker said earlier, be transparent. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves, but if you don't know what the numbers are, you can't let them speak. And today, more than ever, having been through this over the years with the school district, we're in a much better position to allow the numbers to tell the story and also to manage our money in a way that truly we can get the most out of it. So thank you. I see Ms. Johnson-Watts, your hand raised.
Yes, I said this when it was previewed for the Finance Committee or Subcommittee. And I just want to say it publicly to make sure that it is entirely on the record. 100% thrilled with the work that has been done by the IU. It was, I said to someone, I can't remember who it was I said it to, but I said it was like Marie Kondo walked in. And
that was me, sure.
Yes.
I wish I had Marie Kondo's money.
He walked in and looked at the entire situation and began the organization process. And for some people, it may sound, as was said earlier, it may sound like a simple task. Yeah. It was not. And so trust me when I tell you, a great deal of work has been accomplished and to the betterment of this entire district and our children 100%, because it's wonderful to know when you go into the store how much you have to spend or how much you need to take with you to go to the store and how long you have to wait until you can get enough money together to do that. And these are the simple steps that have been made possible. And so I cannot say thank you enough for keeping your nose to the grindstone and just saying, we're going to get this done. You have found a way to rally everyone to the cause, and that is no small feat. So I just want to take a moment to just pause and reflect on that, because what you did was outstanding. There is so much more to be done, but you have to think about what it takes to just get where we are right now. And so I'm just really, really appreciative of the work you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That means a lot.
It does.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Watts. And just to kind of, this is the type of stuff that's not all that exciting, but is really impactful. And you know, it had to be done. It has to be done, and we have to keep getting better, right? That's what we expect for our students, our teachers, our staff, our community. You know, we want the very best. So it starts at home. It starts at central admin, and you know, we're making progress. And I echo Ms. Johnson-Watt's thoughts as well. And does any other colleague, any questions, comments that you have for the IU? Ms. Conover.
Yes, Mr. Thiel. It's always nice. I want to say to Dr. Ibe and Tara, the whole team, our admin. It's always nice to hear that we're moving in the right direction. You know, I always thought that I know, believe me, that it's not an easy job, and it's still not an easy job. We're not nowhere near done. But to hear this report and to see that we are moving in the right direction, it is wonderful to hear. And I just want to say thank you to you guys, because I know many couldn't see it. You know what I mean? We all know what position our district was in prior to you guys coming on board. So I want to say thank you to you. I also want to say thank you to Mr. Parker, because we talked prior to you guys, the board making a decision for you guys to come in the board. So we talked about deliverables, and it sounds like you guys are delivering. So thanks again.
Thank you, Mrs. Conover. Anyone else have any comments or questions from the board? Seeing none, Ms. Ramos, Mr. Parker?
Yeah, so at this point, we'll transition. Again, I want to give kudos to Dr. Ibe, to Kim, to Tara, to Stacy, the entire IU team. This has been a lot of work, and there's no way, if you saw that chart that I put up earlier, where the expected deficit has been reduced, a lot of that is due to the analysis and systems work that you all have been doing behind the scenes. So again, hats off and kudos to you as well. Mr. Ristikajian, who's new, but Ms. Ramos and Dr. Brown have really been pushing this train ahead for us in the district. So great team all around, really excited, really proud. The next piece is we'll introduce PFM, and then Ms. Ramos, I don't know how you want to bring Dean and his team in.
We have Dean Kaplan, Ian Tyson, and Meredith Brett here. I believe we have Clara Lee and Malik. The whole PFM team is here this evening. So we've spent the last, I don't know how many months it's been, but we've gone through interviews, multiple interviews, massive data requests, and lots of conversations to bring forward what we're bringing forward this evening, which is a comprehensive update to our financial projection, coupled with PFM's perspective of where they see some improvements here in 2017. It's one thing for us to say it, but it's also another thing for another outside entity to confirm progress they've seen as they had a close look of our financials in 2017 and back in them again now in 2020, 2021. So Mr. Parker, that's the team. Are we ready to move forward?
We're ready to roll.
Okay, I'm not sure which one's sharing screen from the PFM team, but you should have that ability.
I think I'm starting to speak, but Ian will be handling the presentation, so you should share with him.
Give me 1 second.
Sure. Let's start while we're doing that. There you go. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I'm Dean Kaplan. I'm Managing Director at PFM and the head of our K-12 schools practice, and we appreciate the opportunity to present tonight and to go over our work. I'm joined tonight, as you saw, by most of the members of our team: Ian Tyson, Meredith Brett, Clara Lee, and Malik Jarvis, and all of them will share in tonight's presentation. All of them have been critical parts of the work we've been doing. And as has been mentioned a couple times, when we first engaged with the district about 4 years ago to look at financial trends and develop a multi-year financial projection with different scenarios, as Mr. Parker mentioned, And then came back in the fall. We were re-engaged in November to update those projections and develop a more full multi-year plan. So tonight, we're here to brief you on the first part of our work, which is the baseline financial projection. As Ms. Ramos mentioned, as part of this, we've also evaluated the progress in district operations and financial management over the past several years, and we'll discuss that actually right after I finish speaking. And it's important to note that in the final plan we present, which will be the next time we appear before you, we'll include a series of initiatives to address the district's remaining financial and operational challenges. So tonight is really kind of the baseline, which shows the status quo scenario with no major changes from current policies or practices. It'll also, that baseline really reviews the key assumptions and drivers that affect the baseline results. We'll tell you a bit about kind of where we're starting from. And of course, if we made different assumptions, things might look a little different, but part of the benefit of this kind of modeling is that we can make those changes and see what would happen. It's also helpful to note that while there are a lot of external developments that may affect the baseline, including a lot that are happening right now, we have ESSER II funding, the state budget as announced by the governor. We'll address those at the end of our presentation this evening, but for now we're really focusing on the baseline so that we all know our starting point before anything good or potentially good or other curveballs are thrown our way. Sort of where do we stand, and then we can make different assumptions from there about some of the potential changes that might happen. So we're going to start with a short retrospective look at the change that's happened in the district since 2017-18 when we looked last time. And as a couple of people have mentioned, I think all of you are really aware that you've made some really remarkable progress in bringing in strong leaders and improving the revenue situation. And CLIU's work has been impressive and really critical, as all of you noted. I do want to take a second, just as CLIU did, to really give credit to the district staff, team up and down across. When you retained us in November, early December, we were running right into the holidays. It was a time that made it, kind of tough to turn around a lot of work on our side and your side. And I would say, we do work with a few other districts. And your team was really at the top in terms of its ability to get us what we needed as fast as we could so we could get to this point tonight and not get bogged down in the multiple time off we've had. And of course, they're already operating under tremendous with tremendous barriers because of COVID. So they really stand out compared to a lot of the other places we're engaged with, and I really want to give credit to all of them. Pretty much the same list that Ms. Hauser mentioned. So we're going to go to start off by talking about kind of what's happened since our last review, and Meredith is going to kick off that section, and I'm going to hand off to her.
Good evening, everyone. As Dee mentioned, my name is Meredith Brett. I'm a member of the team. And as we start to think about where the district is today, and I think as other folks have mentioned, we just sort of wanted to ground it in looking back at where you all were in 17-18 and the progress that's been made since then. So the district has taken significant steps to address the findings that we identified in our report, as well as the findings from other reviews at that time. I think as we've talked about it, as we saw tonight, in order to improve some of the financial oversight and improve its operational capacity, you guys brought in the Carbon Lehigh Intermediate Unit, which has brought in members of their own team with experience in school finance and human resources to help the district execute some of the day-to-day work, as well as to engage in some of these larger strategic projects. The IU has supported establishing budget planning processes and procedures. They've also worked to align and organize your budget codes and assist with several critical systems that you talked about tonight, helping to build a really functional position control system to track the district's personnel, and also to help implement Skyward, the district's data and management system, which are obviously critical systems to have in place. In addition, since our last report, the district has built up its own internal capacity by hiring individuals to fill key roles in the administrative team, including in finance and HR. And these people are working with the district and the IU staff on these academic and operational priorities. And in our current engagement, of course, I think as we mentioned, we interviewed and spent time with a lot of staff from the district. And one of the key areas we wanted to talk with and engage with them on is around this issue of progress, where you were and where you are today. So on the next several slides, we'll talk about some of the results of those conversations. So as I mentioned, we spoke with staff who oversee key functions, including academic programs such as grants, equity, charter oversight, special ed. And we also talked with folks in central office and support staff functions, including finance and HR, IT, facilities. And the conversations we've had really underscore our belief that the district has really improved its administrative capacity. During the conversation, staff acknowledged the challenges that they face and the challenges, of course, presented by the pandemic. But they also shared, that they were proud of their ability to make decisions and adjust quickly during that same time. Staff remain engaged around issues of continuous improvement, as well as in executing strategic priorities. In our conversations, we found that staff are also really engaged in their department's operations and are actively developing strategies to address some of the challenges that they're currently facing. In fact, I think maybe one of the more common refrains we heard is that there's so much to do. I wish I could clone myself, or I wish there was another me, or a middle manager between myself and some of these other folks to support them. So Ian, if you can flip to the next slide. So in addition to improving some of the administrative capacity, the district has also made significant improvements in its staff and systems. So on these next few slides that I'll go through, we'll note the progress here and some of the remaining challenges in some of these key areas. But I, again, just sort of want to note the overall progress here the district has made is significant. And there's a really strong team that's in place right now to help them address some of these remaining challenges that you'll see on these slides. So under curriculum and programs, the district completed a curriculum audit in 17-18, and it has continued to invest in its special education supports in district buildings and in keeping the appropriate records required for reimbursement. Here you'll see the remaining challenge is one that a lot of districts are dealing with, which is there's not enough resources to do everything you want to do academically. But that's, again, as I said, that's normal. The district has a lot of curricular priorities. Under equity, the district has really also taken the lead here in appointing a deputy superintendent of equity, accountability, and school improvement. So this position, of course, also oversees grants and charter school oversight. And one of the things we were really impressed with during our conversation around equity is that there's an allocation formula that the district is using to drive its district's resources based on student and building needs. Another highlight in terms of progress is the grant that you all received from the Century Foundation related to school improvement. So I think just talking through that, the scope of what that deputy superintendent oversees sort of speaks to the need mentioned by some of the staff in our interview about wanting additional staff resources and additional revenue to help support some of the work that they're doing. On the next slide, thinking about facilities, the district recently completed an update of its facilities needs and related costs this year. And I think the remaining challenge that you'll see here on the facilities front is, again, one that districts face. How to continue to invest and protect your existing district buildings? How do you keep repair and upkeep in your existing buildings and keep them safe and well maintained? The district also has successfully under the IT chart used some of its pandemic funds to expand its technology and support systems for staff and students, including ensuring that all students have the devices that they need to allow them to be educated remotely. Under the remaining challenges, what that's going to take is obviously technology and other equipment has a life cycle. So, when you purchase a number of pieces of equipment at the same time, it all needs to be replaced right around the same time. So keeping that in mind is going to be a remaining challenge. And then under finance and human resources, the district, as we've talked about, has definitely made strides here with its relationship with the IU and by hiring really capable staff in critical positions. And moving forward, I think the challenge there is going to be staffing and training everybody in those departments to solidify that the improvements and processes and systems that have already been made And a key step is going to be eventually, developing a transition plan for those responsibilities to shift back from the folks at the IU and back into district staff. The district, as we talked about, also completed its review of Skyward, looking at how it's currently being used and also at potential additional functionality. The district's efforts around position control and improving its budget account codes are also really notable improvements. I think, as we discussed, it's really the foundation of your budget and the foundation of your structure. And if you don't have a solid foundation, then a lot of the other work that you're going to try to do sort of around the edges and not really at the heart of the problem. And you guys have sort of driven right at the heart of the problem and started to build these processes and structures and put a really great foundation in place. Moving into the future, thinking about Skyward, again, staff training, making sure that all staff really understand all of the functionality and capability that Skyward has so that you can use it appropriately, and thinking through whether or not at some point the district is going to need an additional, ERP system is definitely something to monitor in the future.
Thanks, Meredith. So I will pick up from here with just some comments on some of the themes that Mr. Parker discussed in his introduction. The last time that we worked with the district back in 2017-18, we saw some of those large projected deficits, especially with the cumulative negative fund balance that Mr. Parker showed. But there's been a lot of progress since then in the district's finances. So on the revenue side, there's been a lot of increases in resources for the district compared to that baseline scenario that we looked at a couple of years ago. Some of that came from your internal changes, looking at property tax increases in years when that could be a tough thing to do. Some additional state aid, coming from the formula funds, basic education funding, special education funding, the receipt of $10 million in a supplemental Ready to Learn block grant fund. And all that contributed to sort of closing that gap, or part of the gap that we had looked at the last time around. At the same time, I think there are still some challenges that the district faces. So some of the things that Meredith picked up in her presentation, Allentown is not alone in some of the economic challenges that you're facing in terms of how the pandemic impacts the local economy, not just the economy here in Allentown, but also across the state, and what that means for education funding and support from the Commonwealth. A lot of districts are facing that uncertainty. So, that's something that long-term planning, like the process that we're doing now, can really help you wrap your head around, what do changes in those assumptions mean, and how can we manage around them? At the same time, there's also some cost pressures that the district continues to face. These were some areas that we had highlighted in our previous analysis, and I think you'll see in a couple of slides that even though some of the details of each of these areas might have changed over the past couple of years, they definitely do remain challenges in terms of putting together a budget each year. And some of the ones that we have here highlighted here for charter school tuition, transportation, healthcare, a lot of these costs tend to grow a lot faster than revenues. A little bit of a closer look on the revenue projections from our previous work compared to some of the actual results. So the line in blue at the bottom, that's the total revenues for the district's projections from our previous baseline. And the line above that in the black highlights some of those revenue impacts that I talked about on the previous slide. Those additional resources contributed to a lot faster revenue growth than what we had saw in the prior round. And on the expenditure side, you could sort of see that the line is a little bit closer together. And I think that the story doesn't come out quite as clear here, because I think what this also doesn't show is the annual budgeting process where, you have to come in and determine, what are your resources and how you're going to spend them each year. This is the actual results, not the deficits that you would have been facing at the beginning of that planning period. With that, we'll talk about some of those major changes on the driver side for the bigger parts of your revenue and expenditure budget. And for that, I'll turn that over to Clara.
Thanks, Ian. So I'll jump into some of the updates that we've made to the district's financial projections, starting off with the baseline. So for our projections, we begin with the district's current year budget. So in the year of 2020-2021, the district budgeted for around $350 million back in July when it approved its budget. So in the pie charts in front of you, we've broken down the district's total revenues and expenditures based on different categories. So to start off on the left with the revenues, in the blue, you can see the district's local sources. In the yellow are its state sources, and then the federal and other sources are in the gray. The largest portion of the district's revenues are from the state sources, and of the state sources, the state education funding. The state sources consist of around 58% of the district's total revenue. So it is a majority of the funds that the district sees. And then on the expenditure side, the largest costs are around salaries and benefits, which consist of over 62% of the district's budget. And charter school tuition is also a major cost for the district as it goes into the 2020-2021 school year. One thing to note about the district's budget is that the district projected to have an operating deficit this school year of around $3.3 million when it created its budget. And on the revenue side, it includes the additional one-time CARES Act funds for this school year of around $9.8 million. So those are two things to just keep in mind as we go into projections and how that might affect trends in the out years. So for the general drivers for the district, similar to some of the themes that Dr. Parker talked about and Ian had mentioned, to get a better sense of what the district's current financial situation is and to frame our projections, we took a look back at the different trends that the district has seen in major revenue and expenditure drivers. So as you can see in the bar graph below, for the revenues in total, the district has seen around a 4.6% growth annually. And for the expenditures, it slightly outpaced it at 5.8%. One thing, or for the revenues, the largest growth has been in the state reimbursements at around 13.8% annually, which is impacted by the reimbursement percentage and how much the district is spending in PSERS and Social Security, as it consists of both reimbursements. And then on the expenditure side, that growth is matched by charter tuition at 13.8% as well. One thing to note about this graph is that it shows how major drivers that are trending or that are impacting the district's budget is changing over time, but it's not reflective of the actual dollar change that these items have seen during the 5-year period between 2014-15 and 19-20. We'll get into the dollar changes in the next couple of slides, but as an example, the district's state education funding, which has grown by around 4.4% a year, during that period grew by around $25 million. And on the expenditure side, charter tuition, even though it's seen a growth of 13.8%, has also grown by around 26. So the district has seen consistent growth in state funding, but majority of those costs are going into charter tuition because of the rapid growth that the district has seen in that specific expenditure item, just as an example of how what this graph is trying to show. So I'm going to break down some of the major dollar changes that the district has seen for both revenues and expenditures, starting with its revenues. So over the same 5-year period, the district has seen an increase in its revenues by around $64 million. And a majority of that, around 80%, is from changes to its state sources. And of that, the largest portion is in its state education funding, so basic education and special education. With the district's growth in its student population and the general student demographics, the district benefits from the funding formula that the state uses and the gradual increases that the district will see over the years. And even in this current year, even though the state funding was held flat at the 19-20 levels, the district still, or the state revenues, state education funding still is the largest source of revenue for the district, if you remember back to a couple slides with the pie charts. And in addition to the state funding, the local sources have also grown relatively significantly for the district, with just general growth in population, as well as different investments that were made in the city. But as local sources tend to be slightly more sensitive to economic activity, that growth might fluctuate in the out year. So that's one thing to note in terms of the projections and different trends we might see. Ian, if you could, okay. For the expenditure side, total expenditures have grown by around 82 million. So in comparison to revenues, it's outpaced revenues by around $18 million over the 5 years. The largest growth here is in the salaries and benefits that the district pays its employees. But another thing to note is that while benefits, as you can see here, has grown the most significantly by $30.4 million, that growth is also offset by growth in reimbursements, as you saw on the previous slide. So the actual growth here is mostly driven by general trends, growth, and higher spending in healthcare. But the district is able to offset some of that growth over time. So it's not as much of a burden for the district. An additional cost here that is growing fairly quickly is the charter tuition, which has grown by a total of $26 million. And that there are a lot of different factors that could go into charter tuition, which we'll get into later into our presentation, such as charter enrollment and the changes in charter tuition rates. So this is somewhere to just keep in mind as the district tries to control costs in the out years and how it impacts their general budget in the future. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ian to go through some of the assumptions that we made as we built out the projections.
Thanks, Clara. So I'll just start off on the local side with the revenue budget. What we're assuming here is a gradual return to economic recovery after the pandemic. So I think one of the themes that we'll talk about tonight is just some of the general uncertainty that we're dealing with right now. Especially with how that impacts not only the district's real estate taxes, but some of the other taxes that can respond pretty quickly to economic changes. So like earned income taxes, local services, real estate transfer taxes, all those can move pretty quickly depending on what's going on with the broader economy. So essentially for most of those taxes, we're assuming a return to recent trends over a 2-year period, and then historical growth after that. For real estate taxes, we're assuming that there's going to be some growth in the tax base over time at the historic rate of about 1%. So we have the assessed value report for next year, and we're using that for our planning purposes. And after that, we're assuming that the growth in assessed value continues. On the state side, because the state budget will take a couple of months to work through the legislature after the governor's proposal, right now we're starting from the most conservative position for basic education funding and special education funding. For the baseline projections, we're assuming that this would be the 3rd year of flat funding. So this would be at the 1920 levels for next year. So this would be the same allocation that the district has seen last year, the current year, and then the following year and next year. And then we're assuming that growth will continue after that. So money would go through the formula-based funding, and then that would drive out funding to Allentown. On the federal sources, Clara mentioned the CARES Act funds. So this would be the first round of federal relief that was passed in March. Those are baked into the 2021 budget, and we are removing those after the current year, assuming that the funds go away after they're spent this year. And then we'll get into this later in the presentation. Right now, the baseline doesn't show the impact of the December federal relief. So this would be the ESSER 2 funds. We'll come back and talk about how that impacts the budget. But for now, we just want to focus on, what are the drivers? How do they change if we don't do anything in the baseline scenario, the status quo? And then we can come back and see how that looks like when we layer that back in. On the expenditure side, we're assuming that salaries are flat after the contracts expire. So again, this is a key driver of the district's budget. So for now, we're starting from the position that after the contracts expire, then the district would have to find funding sources to continue to offer salary increases. At the same time, we're assuming that costs continue to grow for healthcare and the PSERS contribution rates. For charter school enrollment, we assume that we'll get into a little bit more detail what that looks like, but we're assuming that enrollment continues to grow based on historical trends. Part of that being filling out some of the district's brick and mortar schools that have a physical presence either in or around the district, as well as continued increases in students who are attending cyber charter schools. So when you bring that all together, here's what we have for the summary for the baseline budget projections. So In the middle here, we have a chart that shows the high level summary with the bars in yellow showing the operating results. So that's the surplus or deficit. The bars in blue showing the fund balance. And here we're starting off with the adopted budget, 2021 budget, and then 2022, this begins the first year of our projections. So this is showing, based on those assumptions that we had, no real estate tax rate increases, some growth in the tax base, flat state funding for next year, and then growth in the district's costs. We're assuming that the district's budget is going to start off with a deficit of about 35 to 36 million, and then continue to grow over the next 5 years. And we'll get into some of the reasons why in some of the following slides.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll take this next couple of slides. So as the slide notes, and as Ian mentioned earlier, one of the biggest challenges is the significant uncertainty moving forward with the pandemic and with the district's return to normal operations. If those conditions sort of fluctuate as things change, that's obviously going to have a material impact on the district's finances and operations. And so we kind of want to just talk through some of those specific fluctuations that could happen and the impacts they might have. On the educational programs, for example, there's a lot of sort of open questions. The district might need to adjust programs to accommodate shifts in enrollment, social distancing guidelines, or additional supports that students might need when they come back to the schools. And likewise, as you can see on this slide here, on transportation, there's a lot of sort of contingencies moving forward, and an open question of whether or not transportation spending is going to go up or down. And then, of course, any sort of changes in transportation spending will have sort of impacts on future year subsidies from the Commonwealth as well. So with these, I think the thing to underscore here is that it's going to be really important for the district to be forward-looking and critical and multifaceted in its planning, just because of the challenges moving forward with all the uncertainty associated with the pandemic. You want to make sure that you can identify impacts as they come, anticipate them, and then mitigate them with careful planning. And then the next slide just gives a couple of other specific examples of some of these potential challenges. So at the local, state, and federal level, revenue resources are going to be largely dependent on contingencies politically and economically that are hard to predict right now. So at the local level, a lot of the taxes or the tax growth that we're projecting is going to be based on sort of changes in the economic circumstances. So whether or not the post-COVID recovery goes as planned is going to impact the amount of revenue that you can see. And then also thinking more long-term, the impact of the pandemic and what it may have on sort of the population and employment dynamics moving forward may also have a large impact. And then if you also sort of flip that to the sort of state and federal level, there's a lot of economic and political uncertainty associated with what funding is going to be available to the district. We've built out some of these scenarios to kind of walk through some of what this planning looks like. So we'll talk a little bit later about the governor's budget proposal and the impact that may have on the state revenues that the district will receive. But I think sort of like with the last slide, I think the important thing here is that the district has to be very sort of open-minded about these uncertainties and sort of very careful about planning around them. And then for things that they can't control, planning in the near term, for instance, on how to use their ESSER II funds to put themselves in a long-term sustainable position to deal with some of the uncertainties associated with COVID. And then I'm going to pass this on to Ian to talk about some of the budgetary challenges, including or starting with the charter school tuition.
Thanks, Malik. So the charter school tuition projections, they're made up of two big drivers here. So the first one is the enrollment assumption. So that's the number of students who are enrolled and where they're enrolled, whether that's a brick and mortar school or a cyber charter school. And then the other is the tuition calculation. So the spending per student. Part of the challenge that we're facing here is with the response to the pandemic. There's Allentown is not alone in some of the increases that you've seen in charter school tuition. So what we're starting with is a base that's a little bit higher than the budget, and then at the same time there's both the dynamics of the number of students and the calculation of the tuition per student drive those costs for how they're going to change in the future. So starting off with the current year budget, we've got $58 million in the adopted 2021 budget. And with some of the changes with the shift to remote learning, The district's seen a pretty rapid increase in charter school tuition compared to that adopted budget back in July. So again, Allentown's not alone in seeing some of those increases, particularly for students enrolled in cyber charter schools. But that presents a challenge because we're starting from a higher base than what was in the adopted budget. So this is also going to be one of those areas that's going to change and probably change pretty rapidly. Part of that, is going to be what happens with the reopening plans. Do those trends continue? Do students continue to enroll in those schools after the buildings are opened up again? Or do some of those students come back? All those questions will have a large impact for that starting number for the students who are enrolled in those schools, and whether they're there in Allentown school district operated buildings. So for now, we're assuming that the starting point is going to be somewhere in this mid-range for our baseline projections. And here we show that as a total cost. So we've got a retrospective look at some of the prior years of actual spending, and then a forward look at some of the projected increases for the baseline. So here you could see some fairly rapid growth that Clara showed in some of her slides, growing at about a little over 13%, almost 14% per year to 1920. So even though we're assuming that percentage is a little bit lower, in terms of dollars spent on charter school tuition, we're showing almost the same dollar impact over those next 5 years. So this is going to be made up of both enrollment growth and then also increases in the tuition rate per student. And here we're showing an increase from the district's current budget to about $68 million and then growing up to $86 million by 2025-26. Part of the story is driven by where the students are enrolled. So like I said, schools with a physical presence or with in a cyber charter school. What the district's seen in the current year is a pretty large increase in cyber charter students. Here we're showing the trends in brick and mortar enrollment. So this is going to be driven by the capacity of those schools, whether or not there are like physical size limits to the building. So, the number of students who can attend within those enrollment limits, or there might be specific caps written into the charter agreements with those schools. Based on our review of the available data, we think that growth is going to start to slow down as those schools reach their limits, either through the number of classrooms that they have or through the charter agreements with the district. Now, with the students who are enrolled in cyber charter schools, this is an area that's a pretty large risk for the district. The district's seen a pretty large increase in the current year, and what we're assuming is that this growth continues after the baseline, after the starting point of the baseline projection. So we're assuming that this growth trend continues, that we kind of fill out the schools in the brick and mortar section, and that there's continued growth in the cyber students. At the same time, the demographic makeup of the district's charter school students has changed in recent years. In the current year, there's been a large increase in the number of students who are identified as special education. So in percentage terms, the district's students who were special education enrolled in charter schools hovered between 12 and 13%. And then in the current year, that increases to almost 18%. And then we're assuming for the baseline that this continues, that those students are going to stay enrolled in those charter schools, that growth is going to continue on top of that. And both those factors, the increase in the number of students and then the increase in the cost for the students are going to drive those tuition costs that we saw in the slide before. And here we take a look at what that means per student. So this is the spending per student for the tuition rates based on the formula calculations for the district that are for charter schools. So here the key takeaway here is that this large increase in the number of special education students also translates into a fairly large budget impact. So in the current year, the district's special education tuition rate is almost 2.5 times the regular education rate. So the higher number of special education students, that's one of those factors for why we saw that bar chart with those lines above the current year budget. The increase in the number of students who are special education who are being paid the special education rate. That's driving one of those changes. And since the baseline projections also show continued growth in costs, that's also going to drive up those tuition rates over time. So here we see that growth for the baseline projections. And again, this will change. So as we start to layer in other assumptions, so if we show savings initiatives or if we show higher growth in cost categories, that's also going to drive these tuition rates most likely higher than what we're showing here if the costs are not offset by savings elsewhere. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but healthcare costs are one of those cost pressures for the district. Healthcare tends to grow a lot more rapidly than other parts of the expenditure budget. Costs can grow well above inflation, and Allentown has seen costs that are in the range of 6% over that 5-year period that we looked at with the actuals. So we're assuming that with no changes in the district's healthcare plan or any changes in cost sharing agreements, that your costs are going to start to grow at the national average, so by about 7 to 8% per year for the baseline projection. Again, at the same time, so going back to the baseline projections with the salary assumption. So right now we're assuming that there are no salary increases after the expiration of the district's current collective bargaining agreements. We know that this is just for planning purposes. This is not a recommendation that you do not offer salary increases for 5 years, or you do not raise taxes for 5 years. This is just to highlight, what are the areas in your budget stress if you do not make any changes. So here we'd like to just recognize that providing competitive salaries is a very important goal for the district, and part of this planning process for the multi-year plan will be identifying funds so that you can continue to offer those salary increases for your staff over time. And part of the challenge there will be coming up with those funds in a way that doesn't increase that gap that we're seeing in the baseline projection. Malik talked about this a little bit earlier, but decisions on the district's operations for transportation will have an impact on both the costs and then the subsidy for the next several years. So with the pandemic response, a lot of school districts, Allentown included, negotiated some lower payment rates for the 1920 school year. And then decisions that are made for the current year, whether or not to make those minimum payments to the contractor or take the most savings that you can in the current year, those will have an impact on your subsidy. So if you do take those savings and your subsidy decreases, what you would likely see is next year with a return to normal operations, you'd see the full cost without the full subsidy. That subsidy would lag by about a year. And then for addressing the structural deficit, again, since this is the baseline scenario, this is more diagnosing what the trends look like without corrective action. So again, we just like to highlight that the district has made a lot of significant improvement in its financial management since the last time that we did our review of the district's finances. However, I think because of what we're seeing in the trends for the district's expenditures, there's going to be some significant challenges based on some of those cost pressures that you're seeing in that baseline projection. So, resolving those deficits will require focusing on those bigger pieces of the budget. So, that's going to focus on the revenue side, what tax increases look like over the next several years, what state aid growth looks like, especially with the governor's budget proposal under consideration, the current negotiations going on in the legislature, and then what that looks like for future years. All that will play into the revenues that you'll have available for funding the district. We talked a little bit about salaries, but providing salary increases, controlling that growth in healthcare costs over time, those will be the important focuses for managing that gap that we saw in the baseline projections. And for the charter school enrollment, both that's focusing on offering attractive options for district parents so that the district can compete to attract those students to district operated schools, and curbing some of that growth in enrollment through high quality programming and outreach to those parents. And then we talked about this a little bit earlier, but at the same time, within those challenges, trying to identify funds to invest in the district's buildings. So the district's feasibility study has identified some pretty large costs to rehabilitate the district's buildings. And again, that's going to be part of the focus for the second part of this is, initiatives to address these budget drivers and then finding funds to invest in these priorities. So at the same time, just solving for zero for the budget gap, that's one way of looking at this. But financial planning for a school district is much more than that. A district is not there to produce a balanced budget each year. The district's there to educate its students and provide those needed support services for them. At the same time for coming up with those initiatives to close that gap, one of the things the three couple areas that we're looking at here are continuing to provide funds for the district's important goals for expanding equity for its curricular resources, support services for students, and school improvement initiatives that are underway, identifying funds for facility investments, and then again for the information technology, making sure that you continue to make set aside resources so that you can replace those equipment over time. And then at the same time, also invest in administrative systems that you may need to upgrade over the next several years. So one of the levers that the district controls are tax rates. So in the baseline, what we looked at was a status quo scenario, no increases in tax rates, continued growth in cost categories, and some return to economic recovery for some of those local taxes. Here, what we're looking at is the first of two tax scenarios. So this is 2.3% increase each year. This is about half of what your Act 1 index is. So the Act 1 index would be the maximum amount you could raise your taxes for next year. This is about half of that at 2.3%. And in the back of your mind, you could probably consider this about an inflationary increase in your tax rate over the next 5 years. For baseline projections, inflation is about 2%, and this is a little bit higher than that at 2.3%. So here, the starting deficit that we were working with in the baseline was about 35 million. This cuts it down by about 2 million to 33 million. And whereas the final gap was somewhere around 54 to 55 million, the district's deficit kind of stabilizes at about $40 million with that regular increase in the tax rate. But again, without salary increases and without other initiatives to close that gap, the 2.3% tax increases alone are not enough to close that gap. At the other extreme here, what we're looking at are annual increases to the Act 1 index. So the district's Act 1 index for next year would be 4.6%. And this scenario looks at what happens if you did that each year for the next 5 years. So this is a much faster tax rate increase than the prior slide. And you could see how that higher tax increase feeds into the financial projections. So before we were starting off with a deficit of about 35 million. Here we're a little bit over 30 million. So puts a little bit of a dent in the starting position for the deficit. But because the tax rate is increasing faster than the previous slide, you can see that gap stabilizes at about 30 to 35 million. So a little bit lower than the 2.3% tax increase scenario on the previous slide. And then here it starts to dip below 30 million in the final year. So these two trends, this slide and the previous slide, what they tell me is that these regular increases in your tax rate, once you start to layer that into the projections, that's when the revenues start to grow faster than the expenditures in the baseline. So when we looked at the baseline projection with the deficits growing from 35 to 55 million, the key takeaway there is that because of the assumptions on the revenue side with no tax increases and the state aid assumptions just continuing at their historic levels and no increases in federal aid, the expenditure growth is going to grow a lot faster than that. And here with those regular tax increases, that sort of bends the curve the other way. And now the revenues are starting to grow slightly faster, but again, still not enough to close the gap. You'd have to walk this projection out for another 5 to 10 years before that would actually switch over from a deficit here to a surplus. So with taxes being the major lever that the district controls on the revenue side, on the expenditure side, other than the salaries, charter school tuition is the second highest cost for the district's budget after those personnel costs. So here what we're looking at are the tax increases and a very optimistic assumption for the charter school enrollment. So this holds the district's enrollment flat at the current at a recent count, the October count for the current school year, and shows how that impacts the projections. So here the district's annual deficit stabilizes at a little bit under $30 million, so 27 million, and then starts to get chipped away by about $3 million starting in the last 2 years, and then dropping below 20 million for the final year of the projections. So here with those regular tax increases and with charter school enrollment flat, those still don't quite close the remainder of the gap. So we'll get into what that means for the next round of our planning in the next slide.
Great. So obviously this shows us what we wanted to do was give you a sense of the baseline, what some of the drivers were, and then a feeling for what are some of the big swings that you could take at the deficit numbers. And obviously, as you can see, even with a fairly regular significant tax increases and some flattening on the charter enrollment curve, there's still a hole there. And part of our assignment is to come back with ideas to fill the rest of that gap or things that you could do in lieu of that. And that's our next deliverable. But I think the thing that's really telling to us is that the district will need to address some of these large drivers in order to fill its gap. You obviously can't tax your way out, and you wouldn't want to. That's a tough thing for board members to talk to the community about. We recognize. So really, we're focusing on the other major drivers. Contract negotiations, as Ian said. How do we get fair, competitive salaries for staff while keeping it affordable for the district? That includes both obviously salaries and benefits. The overall charter school tuition trend, which it was affected by the pandemic, and the ability to kind of to deal with that issue. There, of course, are other ways to address some of these costs, and we will talk further about transportation and capital planning and other issues in our next round report. But most of those are smaller, and we'll need to suggest that you adopt some of them, some number of them, in order to fill the rest of the gap. But there'll be, I think, quite a lengthy list for that. So the concluding phase of our work will be on that. For tonight, what we wanted to leave you with was a little bit of a picture of what happens given some of the other wild cards we know are out there right now. We need to know the baseline in order to have a sense of where we're standing. But given all the uncertainty that Malik described and we've gone through, we did want to look at what happens with the ESSER II funds and what happens with the governor's proposal. Now, obviously, we know the district's developing recommendations for how it would use ESSER II, so we're just looking at it at a gross level. And of course, the governor's proposal, while very encouraging, still has to be acted on by the General Assembly, and presumably that won't happen until June. So the uncertainty will continue, but there are some potential alternatives out there. And what we did at the request of the district was just provide some high-level initial views of those. And frankly, some of the numbers now are still pretty unclear, especially we haven't had the chance to check all of the calculations on the governor's proposal with PDE. But we have a good sense from there what they have published of what would come to Allentown and what the impact might be. So Ian's going to briefly look at the governor's impact, the potential impact of the governor's proposal, and the potential impact of the ESSER II funds.
Thanks, Dean. So we're going to start off with the federal funds. This is the most firm one because this is the round of relief that was passed in December. And again, I think the lessons here will just broadly apply to any future rounds of potential relief. The Congress is considering another round coming up in March, and I think the purposes of that and how that feeds in the planning would also apply here. So here what we're looking at is the district's allocation for the second round of relief, the ESSER II funds. Based on what's in the current allocations from PDE, the district's slated to receive almost 44 million, 43.6 million. That's to be spent between this current year, 2021, and September 2023. And what we're looking at here is the baseline scenario. So that chart and table from a couple of slides ago. But the only change that we're layering in here is the addition of the ESSER funds in the first projected year. So even though that they're available to be spent from this current budget year, we layered them into 2021-22, assuming that the district would just put them towards planning purposes for next year. So here, with the full use of those funds for next year, this completely eliminates that $35 million deficit, and the district's left over with a slight surplus of about $8 million. But again, because those are one-time funds, and if they're not put towards, if they're just put towards a continuity of operations, and they're not put towards anything else that might have a different return on investment, the money comes in the current year and then it goes away. So these deficits return in 2022-23, and the baseline projections more or less look the same for the out years, except the cumulative fund balance changes because of that surplus for the starting year, or for the first year of the projections. So here, this buys you a little bit of breathing room. But again, those larger drivers that are taking place underneath the federal revenue assumption there, the growth in the expenditures, the slight growth in the revenues, those are continuing in the background. So that gap opens up in that following year, 2022-23. So how should we treat these for planning purposes? So as a best practice, one-time funds, we generally recommend that the district spend those on one-time expenditures, because otherwise you're using temporary funds to cover long-term expenses. So, to some extent, the district may not be able to use every single dollar towards a one-time expense. So with a lot of the first round of federal relief, Allentown and a lot of other places purchased things like laptops and hotspots. Some of those funds went towards supporting existing staff. Those one-time funds going towards those one-time expenses like the laptops, the money comes in, the money goes away after the grant goes away. But if those are going towards like covering staff salaries and benefits, then the district has to come up with funding sources once that grant expires. So again, like we showed in the previous slide, those ESSER 2 funds, they address that shortfall for the first year of the projection. There's a little bit of money that is above that projected shortfall amount. So some of that could be used towards other programming purposes. Some of that could be used for the following year shortfall. But again, that would be using some of those grant funds for some of those recurring costs. So we talked a little bit about how there's that continued growth in the expenditures going on underneath that, so the same baseline projections continue. So the ESSER 2 funds could be used as a bridge as part of this planning purposes. They could cover part of that gap that we're showing for next year. But again, if that's the only action that's taken, those deficits return. So that just highlights the fact that this could be one option in the tool chest that you could use. But there are probably some other decisions that should be made along the way so that you can start to chip away at that gap over time, rather than facing that all at once after the expiration of those funds. The other scenario that we looked at were the financial impacts of the governor's budget proposal. So in the baseline, what we're looking at again is just what are the challenges that you're facing? What are the revenues? How are the revenues growing? How are the expenditures growing? What happens when we focus in on what assumptions really drive that gap over time? And this sort of hones in on what are the areas that you should focus on for that menu of options that we're going to come back with for those initiatives to address that gap over time. At the same time, there's a lot of alternatives that we could look at here. So we looked at the one with the ESSER 2 funds, with the governor's budget proposal, because this is not, this has not been enacted. I think I consider this to be a what if scenario. So what we're showing here is what would the financial impact of that be? There's the significant increase in basic education funding. not only with making sure that Allentown and other school districts receive the full amount that would have been driven out through the formula funding for this year, but also an increase in the aid that would go through that formula calculation, increases in support for special education funding, and then also changes in the charter school tuition calculation. So, this is going to show a pretty large swing in the district's projection. So we'll get to that in a second. But that initial influx of funding through basic education funding, special education funding, sort of curbing that growth in the charter school tuition growth over time, that's going to allow the district to make some major investments right up front. That could be in staff, that could be in buildings, that could be in curriculum and services. And again, this is going to show that with those changes in the district's budget, how those impact that compared to the baseline. So here, this is showing the impact of both those revenue changes. So the increases in state funding, and then also charter school enrollment. So here, what we're showing is the baseline projections, the Allentown School District allocations for BEF and SEF, our estimates for how those charter school enrollment trends would be impacted by those tuition rate changes. And then after the current year, so we're assuming that this is the governor's budget proposal. And then in years afterward, there's a return to what I guess I'd call historical rates of increase for BEF and SEF. So it's the governor's budget proposal here, and then there's continued increases in these out years based on the prior several years of increases. So here, those deficits completely change. Instead of starting off with the negative 35 million, the district starts off with a surplus of about 90 million because of that influx of funds from state aid in that first year. And then I think the only other thing that I'd like to highlight here is that, this is the same assumptions as the baseline projection. So no increases in tax rates, no increases in salaries. We let the charter school enrollment trends continue as they are. So the only adjustment that we're making there is with the tuition rate calculations. So even though we're starting off with a surplus this year, that slowly dwindles over the next 4 years. So what this tells me is that even with those significant changes for funding, for basic education funding, special education funding, and the charter school tuition, if nothing changes after that, the district's costs do start to grow. So it's not a one-time solution. Budget planning is something that you come back to every single year. So again, I think that this just highlights that this alleviates a lot of your pressure in the short term, gives you a significant influx of funds to invest in your priorities. But again, I think it resets you in a place where you can start to manage those changes over time with less drastic changes. So that
completes our presentation. Yeah, I was going to say that we're done with our presentation. Will be. I think Mr. Parker and Ms. Ramos might have something to say, and then obviously we're happy to answer any questions they'd like us to.
Yeah, the only thing, first of all, thank you for that presentation and that walkthrough the district's financial future. One of the things that I often remind my team about when we look at data like this is that we're looking at calculations, not recommendations. This is kind of raw data and information for us to process and then make decisions on in the future. So I'll just kind of give that reminder as well that I use with my team. Again, I'll probably come back at the end with a few thoughts, but I'll defer back to Mr. Thiel in terms of any questions or comments from the board.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. I'll open it up to any questions, comments that my colleagues in the board have. Mrs. Conover, you have your hand raised. I believe that was from the last presentation. But I would entertain any questions or comments you have for this presentation as well.
I don't have any comments. That was from the last presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dill.
You're welcome. I'll make a comment or so. First of all, I just want to thank PFM. Having been here for some years and worked through the 2017 report. I mean, this is clearly different than what we did then. They have much more data to work with today than they did then, and they've clearly identified that. And you know, back to the IU, but also back to Mr. Parker and Dr. Brown and Jen Ramos and all the staff, HR, business office, who have worked so tirelessly. You know, we don't show these numbers often, but I'm sure our staffing numbers, comparably to what standards are in school districts, our staffing numbers are pretty low. So people are doing more than a person's work. And we just want to thank everybody for working together with PFM and working together with the IU. In regards to the scenarios that were shared out here by PFM, you know, obviously the last one is one that I'm sure, you know, Ian and Dean and Meredith, you know, and Clara were like, I don't know if we want to show that one, because that's a unicorn, you know. We know the governor has presented a budget. We know it's got to go through its process in Harrisburg, but it does give an illustration of the possibilities and the potential should the state actually put new money into the new funding formula, which will drive out considerably for our school district, given the demographics that are driven in the new funding formula. So we have certain things we can do as an organization. We have certain things in our control. We're working through those things. We're taking responsibility, whether it be in the business office and HR with the systems and processes that we've talked about. That's been a long time. We've already, you know, I am so pleased to see the progress. It gives me continued hope and also energy serving on the school board, considering what I experienced in the past and what we're able to do today. So we keep moving forward with that. However, in the funding side, we have certain levers we can do as a board, and we're obviously going to be, you know, as we're in the middle of budget season now, looking at some of those levers and those scenarios were demonstrated through us with PFM, and we'll continue to use that as a basis for some of the decisions moving forward and as they come up with their final presentation. But in the meantime, we also have, you know, some advocacy that we can do as a body. And I think that one last scenario obviously illustrates something that probably is not going to make it through the legislature, just pragmatically speaking, but something that clearly illustrates what is necessary in some way, shape, or form. And that is that this school district needs state funding, new money to come through the formula. That's what Allentown needs, not Charlie Thiel, not the board, not Mr. Parker, not Lucretia Brown, Dr. Brown, not Jen Ramos, not PFM, but the kids in Allentown need new money to come through the new funding formula that's been established 4 or 5 years ago. And that unequivocally will affect our students. That means we can move the needle in this district and really provide the education, a first-class education that our students and our community deserve. So I just wanted to get that off my chest, along with a big thank you to the staff and to, you know, for all the work that they've done. So anyone else have any comments they'd like to make or any questions?
No further comment. You said it all. It's 100%.
Okay, let's move on to then, this is a public meeting. We'll move on to public comment on non-agenda items. So if you're with us here tonight and attending the meeting, please raise your hand and you'll be able to comment on anything. And you have 3 minutes to make comment, and we certainly would you know, appreciate any comments coming our way. And as the board of directors, we're here to listen. And seeing no hands being raised, I'll ask my colleagues, is there any old business for the Finance Committee of the whole? Any new business? And I would once again thank everybody for joining us tonight, and we have lots of work to do as a group, and I thank my colleagues, and let's continue to roll up our sleeves and work with the administration and PFM and the IU, and thank everybody for everything as we continue to move forward for the sake of our kids and our community. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion.
Mrs.
Second.
Conover, do I have a second?
Second.
Mrs. Johnson Watts, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all, everybody. Have a great night.
Night, folks.
Good night.
Thank you.